Hey again, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Speaking of Sundara, where I talk about Sundara, Dawn of a New Age, my fantasy RPG setting. This week, I wanted to kind of reach back to an earlier episode that I did of this show and touch on a topic that has become relevant in wider RPG circles again, which is an interesting feeling. I'm usually the one behind the curve trying to fix mistakes as they go on. It's odd to be out in front of something this time. But when I first started making Sundara, I asked the community what is something that would get you interested in a new fantasy setting? What is something you would be curious about that would get your interest away from whatever world you're currently playing in? And the dominant answer among all people when I asked this was they wanted a game without alignment. Not one where it was smaller, where it was in the background, one where it was gone entirely. And so, because I hadn't really constructed the cosmos yet, that was something that I took into account as a designer, and I made sure that my setting going forward didn't use alignment no matter what edition I was playing it in. Folks who have seen it know that it is currently available in Pathfinder Classic and in Dungeons & Dragons 5th edition, and hopefully, fingers crossed, there should be some releases for Pathfinder 2nd edition coming forward. That's where things become relevant and we cross paths. For folks who were living under a rock earlier this year, Wizards of the Coast, the owners of Dungeons & Dragons, attempted to get rid of the open game license. This led to a lot of very tense back and forth, a lot of very angry players who canceled their subscriptions, who more or less forced Hasbro's hand to stop what they were doing and to take their grip off the OGL. By the time they'd done that, though, a lot of other designers had come out and they were making their own licenses, making their own new settings, making their own IPs, where previously they would have used something that would have belonged to Wizards. And one of those is, probably their biggest competitor, if you look at the market and we're honest with ourselves, is Paizo, the creators of Pathfinder. Now, there was a recent announcement, at least at time of filming, it's probably been a week or two before you're seeing this, but Paizo announced that they are updating and remastering Pathfinder 2nd Edition for the ORC license that they have been creating, which is going to be much more open, much more free. It has the same philosophy that the open game license was first put out with language in it that means that this kind of power grab can't happen in the future, which, yay, good for everybody, good community spirit, that's what we like to see. However, there are a lot of subtle changes, a lot of big changes too, but also a lot of subtle ones that are supposedly happening in this remastering as they're updating the game for this new rule set, the new license, etc., etc. And one of the things, according to recent rumors and rumbles, is they're getting rid of alignment, which for folks who have played Pathfinder is kind of a big deal. It was more important in the Pathfinder Classic or the first edition, but it wasn't entirely gone yet. It was still there. It still affected you. And so there are going to be changes and adjustments that have to be made for getting rid of what was previously an important component. Mechanically, that's not that big of a deal. Designers can do that. I did it, and I am not the most skilled person in the market, so I'm fully convinced that a company with access to teams of very talented individuals can do it in a way that is fair and that maintains the fun of the game. However, the important thing to consider, I think, is that there are a lot of players out there who have raised the issue that without alignment, the world is thrown into chaos and everything becomes relative. And it's phrased in a very, if we change this, society will collapse kind of way. And while I see the perspective, I also think it's important to consider the changes it means for the philosophy of gaming as a whole and what it does to change the adventures you run and the way that you play your games and tell your stories. Now, folks who have been watching these videos for a while will probably hear some of the greatest hits coming out of my mouth here for a second, but bear with me, I am going somewhere with this. Now, when you look at alignment, the 9 boxes that you fit stuff into, generally speaking, the philosophy required for alignment to work is that there has to be a definite set of right, wrong, good and evil, lawful, chaotic within your world. There have to be actual lines that apply to everyone, everywhere, regardless of your culture, your species, your whatever defining characteristic it is. If there is a checklist when you all die and you're being sorted into your afterlives, there has to be someone with a scantron that says this was good, this was bad, this was lawful, this was evil. We've now added up your score. Go to this place. Regardless of what your particular view of the world was, regardless of what your culture says is good or evil, regardless of what your religion told you to do. There is a one right, true answer. And that is very limiting in a lot of ways. It works very well in a game where you have that sort of Tolkien setup of there is good and there is evil, there is lawful, there is chaotic. Well, it's more of a Moorcock thing, but you get where I'm going with this. And if you want to have worlds where those things aren't true, if you want to get rid of things like all of these species are evil, all of these, outsiders from another plane are inherently good, if you want to not have that kind of, I suppose, inborn characteristic or that permanent characteristic where things are a certain thing, then it really helps to get rid of alignment. As a guideline, we can often lean on it like a stereotype. And when you get to that point of, yes, we know this might not be universally true for everyone, but eventually we end up just sort of buying into it and treating everything that way. Whereas if you get rid of it, now you have to take things as we see them. We have to take them at face value. It's that question of one person's good might be another person's evil, one person's lawful might be another person's chaotic, so on and so forth. And for a lot of players who are used to having right answers and wrong answers, that can be very frustrating. It can be very scary in some aspects. If you want to know what you're doing is right without digging into deeper moral questions about it, removing alignment can be very frustrating. It can be a thing that you might not enjoy at your table. And before we go any further, no one is saying you have to play this way. If you like the alignment system, you can just keep it. That's fine. But it's also important to remember when it comes to the morality of our games, because all games have moral aspects to them. If you are rescuing the princess, you are inherently supporting the monarchy and what it stands for. Just things to think about. But removing it also doesn't remove morality from your game. If you get rid of alignment, you still have, what did your society teach you growing up? What did your parents teach you? What lessons have you learned as a person, going about in your life, going about in your adventures? What rules do you have for yourself? What rules do your knightly orders, your street gangs, your armies, what have you been taught? What has made up your morality as an individual? And it seems to be that a lot of folks believe that if there is no greater consequence in the cosmos for what actions you choose to take or what rules you choose to follow, then why are you bothering to follow them? It might be worth thinking about to examine that position, because it's much like having a religion in a fantasy game if you're not a divine caster. You have it because it's part of your character, it's part of your story, it's part of who you are, it's part of what makes you make the decisions you make as the story goes on. It doesn't have to have a mechanical component to it for it to still be important to the story, important to the character, important to the game. And I think that's worth thinking about, particularly if you are a person who is very averse to alignment going away. Ask yourself why. What does it change for you in the game that you really want to keep around? Is it that sense of certainty? Is it that sense of tradition because this is how the game has always been played and that's how it was when you learned? Or is it something else that's worth examining, worth talking about, worth thinking about? Because if we sit down with it and we examine what our feelings about alignment are, what our feelings about morality are in the games that we're playing, it can often lead to us trying out new things, having interesting new adventures, and maybe questioning some stuff that we hadn't previously thought about doing, whether it's having conversations with gnolls, whether it's attempting to use different methods to solve plots, or just not going in with certain assumptions about the world in the game. All of these things are worth considering. But sort of it for my ramble this week, but it felt topical and I wanted to get it out. And for folks who really want a game without alignment, I would recommend checking out Sundara. The setting hasn't had one since day one, and it's one of the core design philosophies of it. It's built on freedom of ideas. So whether or not you want to try something that might be a little on the darker side, or you want to take a solution that wouldn't work in games where things can be shut down because the DM can just say, like, no, they're evil, that won't work, Sundara might be a good setting for you to check out. But with all of that said, there's a lot going on as things are happening, so make sure you subscribe to the channel, check it out. Follow us on any of our social medias you can find for Azukail Games or myself as a creator. And lastly, because it should still be going on at the time the video comes out, I have my first Kickstarter going on. It is not for Sundara, it is for a TTRPG called Army Men, a game of tactical plastic. So if you've ever wanted to take on the role of a plastic army man in a plastic world fighting against weird threats against you and your people, check it out. Link to the Kickstarter should be in the description below. And I'll see you all next time. Happy gaming, everybody.